This morning, we have the pleasure of welcoming back to the podium Dr. Christopher Duraisingh. He's going to share some reflections with us. Having been with us through the assembly, he's sat in on the convention sessions and on synod sessions, and we look forward to your reflections, sir.
Archbishop Fred, National Bishop Susan, and friends. I think I want to begin by saying how much I'm grateful for this opportunity, for this enormous privilege of sharing with you, watching you, hearing you, sometimes shedding a tear of joy with you, seeing you, some of you, cry, rejoice. I should say that I do go back with my hope strengthened, my confidence in the gospel deepened. And those of us who do not have the privilege of interacting with large number of God's people in a place like this, but bound to the four walls of an academic institution, occasionally lose sight of the enormous promise that God's people hold. And you have given me an opportunity for that vision, and I'm grateful for that. Thank you to both of you, and I immensely appreciate that. Now, during the past 4 days, I have witnessed what God can do through a committed group of people, leaders. Time and again, I have been able to watch the ways in which you have inspired one another, challenged one another, and moved on. Particularly the march, if I may use the word, in front of the Parliament building. And yesterday, those who were in the ACC part of the synod had two almost long processions of indigenous people. All of that reminds me back again of things that happened in the early church. So I will begin with that. You remember on the day of Pentecost, people who had gathered in an upper room were driven out and turned as street people. And we have experienced that. Missionary people are those who no longer stay in the upper rooms of these conferences and assemblies, but have to go with their master, even Jesus of Nazareth, who was the street man par excellence, to move to the street, if you will. In other words, simply put, together, the church is a people's movement. I very much hope that we will come to grapple with that very term. Can ECLIC, ACC, can be seen as the womb of, as the matrix of movements of God's people? Upper room, street people. Staying in balcony itself would not be enough. Many of us are very happy to stay in the balcony and watch down what happens in the street. But Pentecost paradigm tells us, no, you shall be on the streets, if you will, as a movement. So a missionary people are a people of a movement. Even as Jesus walked through the dusty roads of Galilee and climbed the rugged paths to Calvary, we are called to be in movement. Slide 1. I look at that particular text of the church as a matrix, a womb of a people on the move. As the Pentecost people move out from the upper room onto the street, following the street who goes ahead. And so much so, within a short while, wherever they went, the last one, these people who have been turning the world upside down have come even here. What would it take What would it mean if you, when you go back to your parishes, your congregations, people may be able to say, here again have come people who turned the world upside down. That is the call, the commitment for us. I'm reminded also, for example, I can't quote you exactly why, but Luther was very restless with the word kirk, church. For him, it sounded of power, not only of the Lord, Kurios, but also it reminded him of the Roman Curia. In its place, his chosen word was the Gemeinde, the gathering, the people. I think we ought to claim for ourselves, as the young people and the indigenous people have shown us, to identify ourselves as a people of the movement. And when we do that, we will be able to see where people are, where God is, what God is doing, and what God wills us to do. Observing the dynamics of the joint assembly sessions as well as the two individual synodal sessions, I'm struck by the fact that your leaders, those two who have sat here and others who shared with you, have shown that they have a third eye. An assembly of third eye people. But the third eye of the heart, it's not simply the empirical eye with which you see who are there, who stands, who has raised his or her hand, who is before the microphone, 1, 2, or 3, 4, or hearing and listening and using reason to understand, but the eye of the heart. In Ephesians chapter 1, when Paul prays for God's people, one of the things that he prays for, that the eye of your heart be illumined. Among the Asian theologians, particularly a Chinese theologian by name C.S. Song, the notion of the third eye is a popular one. The third eye of the heart. Archbishop Fred and Bishop Susan have shed tears sitting here, laughed, humbly retract their steps in love far and off the church. And they are demonstrations for us of the third eye. But I take it that every Pentecost person, every spirit-filled person also has been gifted with a third eye if we would exercise that. Second chapter ends with the actual festival of the Pentecost. I don't know how many of you remember, chapter 3 begins with the third eye being pointed out to us. The text simply says that Peter and Paul, as their custom was, as usual, they went to the temple. But this time, they see differently. They see in the same way Jesus, who made himself the street person, is able to see. They see with the third eye, the eye of compassion, and therefore this man whom they have met, seen again and again, but there is a different kind of a relationship that takes place. My question to you would be, after listening to reports, statements, witnesses, would we be able to claim that particular Pentecostal paradigm of the seeing with the third eye, aching with compassion for people, if you will? A missional community, a missional person, like Jesus of Nazareth, walks the streets of his town, her city, with the third eye. Fellow humans and creation, with the eye of compassion. And strangely, in the biblical narrative, in the gospel narrative, wherever Jesus saw, immediate and had compassion. Second eye sees, the third eye aches deeply. And when that happens, something that this conference, as this particular synodal sessions have expressed deeply a pain, dwindling resources, dwindling numbers, whether expressed or unexpressed. Many have articulated it through their faces and so on, our dining table conversations. But you see, when you see with your third eye what happens? Peter doesn't have to wait for a committee, not for a fundraising campaign. If I were there, I would have put my pocket in and said, no, I have no change, I will give you next week. But he immediately responds, silver and gold I have none, but I will give you what I have. I have a hand, lift him up, rise up, get up and walk in the name of Christ. What a transformation, my sisters and brothers. Your congregations, your parishes, your two churches could go through. If through all that you have heard, cried and prayed for, can turn into you persons of that urgency. As you commit yourself to move on mission. I am reminded of an event in which in 1903, the Indian church, the South Indian church, particularly the Diocese of Tinnevelly, Indigenous Mission Society was born, called Indian Missionary Society, with Indian resources, Indian personnel, and Indian method. How did they support? The women of the village church, the women of the village churches, spontaneously, every time they took rice to cook, they would take one handful of rice, put it in a pot. So at the end of the month, you have 30 handful of rice from every home. So 50 homes come together with measurable amount of rice. Through that, tens and tens of missionaries were sent out to North India, one even to Papua New Guinea. Would this particular conference and on the one hand, your burden concerning the dwindling resources, on the other hand, your visioning of what is possible in the power of the Spirit, something like the handful of rice movement, can that start in both churches? In such a way, spontaneous mission enterprises take place all over the two churches. As I said, I have heard expressed at the dining table and in informal conversation, how can what has happened here, what we have seen here, what the documents that were approved here can be translated, taken back home. Together in Ottawa for the love of the world, commitments have taken place. How can people on the ground be empowered? I have heard this over and over again in dining table conversation. I myself have asked this. That is necessarily so because I remember in the 1960s an important World Council phrase was, all in each place seeking together to glorify God. In every place, all together. In every town, every village, ELCIC, ACC people in that locale joining together. It is that I would want to claim is the purpose of God. An outcome of this very meeting itself. The goal ultimately is in each and every place. I believe fully, and do take it from me, and I have seen in churches, so many countries, at the simplest level, we don't act, we don't get together because we don't see adequately. There can be no town, no reason at all where two or more congregation cannot jointly see, search, look. So I have been wondering, though, from the quest expressed, whether at every town and every village there are two or more churches of these two traditions, can do every 3 months, once in 3 months, once in 6 months, a mission audit. A mission audit cannot take place just by one particular church. Two churches come together to explore what is indeed the case in this particular place. I remember Bishop Mark Hansen muttering the table that we were in the other room and we were talking about the future of the council. I understand ELCA, they talk about the three great listening. Auditing, seeing, where are the hurts and pains are in this particular place. Two congregations jointly explore. What are the promises and the power of God that is already in the people of God? There is not a single person, single congregation without God-given resources. If not money, one's own person, hand, leg, ability to pray. What are the resources? What are the promises that God has given us? And what is God calling us to do today? So, the need, God's promise, and our gifts. If periodically get together to do this, that indeed will enable us to come together for the love of the world. And I have seen this happening in a number of places and churches. Slide 3, please. Third slide. My question is, the third comment that I would like to make is that, here again, what we have heard, what we have done, what we have resolved cannot fully take place in a local congregation unless everything that the church does in the local congregation has a missional dimension to it. Traditionally, we talk about the fivefold functions of the church. All of you know the worship, the preaching, the fellowship, the diaconia, the teaching, known as the fivefold functions of the church. More often than not, now I am in the U.S., I worship in an Episcopal church. I visit at least once a month to another congregation for a mission seminar. Very often it appears to me that these five functions, the same slide again, the five functions are beautifully balanced as a mobile. See that picture there? All the five of them, and we are proud at that. Teaching, so neatly moving, beautiful, and you point out to the choir, point out to this, point out to that. Fivefold functions balanced nicely as a mobile. It has nothing to do with mission commitment here. My question to you is it a nicely balanced mobile, five functions, next slide, or a set of rocket boosters propelling the payload, the church, onto the trajectory, the Missio Dei? I'm not to blame, one of my students did it for me. Service, worship, preaching, fellowship, teaching, all of them energize in order that week by week after week, that particular congregation can be boosted in that Missio Dei orbit, if you will. And I do believe if we do not do that, we will be an attractive mobile, but nothing to do with the movement that God is calling you through all that had happened here. For simple reason, if we had seen through this mission audit, even intercessory prayer, the prayers of the people need not be simply read from a book, but it would be groaning with the groaning of the Spirit. Very often I wonder what it would be after pointing to a particular need in Syria, in Egypt, somewhere. People are quiet for a while and groan and say, "How long, O God? How long?" Northern churches, I do not know about your own congregations, have forgotten the gift of lament. The gift of lament. A congregational prayer that turns into lament and groaning in the groanings of creation, indeed, will become a boosted rocket up in the target, as it were, in the orbit, as it were. Similarly, Eucharistic celebrations, every Eucharistic celebration. Even when I was a student, one of my teachers used to tell me, do you think when Jesus says, this is my body broken for you, this is my blood shed for you, do this in remembrance of me, does Jesus simply mean Sunday after Sunday, come and eat this bread, drink this blood, and remember me? Or is he saying, this is my body broken for you, this is my blood shed for you, but you are the body and blood of Christ. Do this in remembrance of me. Go, let your body be broken, let your blood be shed. You remember me. You re-body forth me. So every Eucharistic service ends with our commitment to go into the streets and to body forth that very Christ's body broken for the life of the world. One more way in the Eucharistic service that I may suggest is that we can energize, that anamnesis part, the memorial part, when we recast the salvation history. More often than not, I would even say 99.9%, our recalling, our memorial of God's mighty acts have to do with some distant past. It doesn't have to do with where we are, what God is doing among us. Now, for example, next Sunday, the anamnesis part would include the tears that you shed here, the hopes that you expressed here, the indigenous people whom you witnessed. Are they not mighty acts of God? It's not the general, this joint assembly, another milestone, a nodal point in the mighty act of God? Would that be remembered? Therefore, with angels and archangels. And what would it mean in energizing us? So my hope and prayer is precisely that every one of the activities that we do can bring to the smallest local congregation of your church and energize. But preceding that, I talked about the mission audit. My next, 2 or 3 points only. The other thing is that I have witnessed here, primarily at the dining table. I normally count how many, what's the ACC color? Red, is it? Yeah. Well, how many red and how many yellow are in this table? I sometimes choose in such a way to see half, can I get in there? But you see, also from the podium, from 2 of your leaders, there is a visible demonstration that ultimately mission is a love affair. In the 80s, in the mission and evangelism, an ecumenical affirmation statement was released in a very popular way. The one paragraph in that begins by the mission in Christ's way is a matter of love. An Asian theologian by name C.S. Song has this to say. Slide 6, please. Christian mission, in essence, should be a love affair of the church with other human beings with whom God has already fallen in love. It's Christian believers building with them a community in the power of God's love. If this is what Christian mission is, then Christian mission is God's mission. Learning to love. Again, as I said in the first one, when he said, together for the love of the world, I told myself several times, and without noticing it, together in love for the life of the world. Together in love. Sometimes we think a little too sentimental. We want to sanitize. We're afraid of saying we are in love. Together in love. This is the first assembly. Already there are signs of being together in love for the world. Will that love grow significantly? The love that is demonstrated, the love that you expressed in the round table once, and so on. And John's gospel and the 3 epistles of John give us that clarion call. Christian witness is not possible until and unless we love in such a way people can say these are Christians. see how the Anglicans and the Lutherans love one another. And as I said in the first one, a Buddhist phrase is interbeing. Interbeing. Where the being runs into the two persons' life runs into each other, and therefore there is a one common nature comes into being. Paul Tillich, this great theologian, used to say, love is that which drives everything that is toward everything else that is. What a beautiful phrase. Love is that drives everything that is, let me use the word, everyone who is here toward everyone else who is here. The two churches being driven to each other, not for common task, important, not for pooling resources, significant, but simply as an inner compulsion driven to each other for loving reconciliation, therefore to witness. Of course, here there is the central role of stories. Could you put slide 8? You may know this black theologian, James Cone. And he argues in that very powerful book, God of the Oppressed, unless we tell our stories, our witness, our truth, our stories in the form of stories, we wouldn't express what we genuinely. So the text is, as I listen to other stories, the Lutheran story and the Anglican story, I'm invited to move out of my own story, my own subjectivity, into another realm of thinking and acting. And I had a glimpse of it now and then, but I wish to God that this will become the practice of this church again and again, to be drawn out of one's own subjectivity, the Lutheran and the Anglican subjectivity and stories. Indeed, it is only when we refuse to listen to another story that our own story becomes ideological. That is a closed system, incapable of hearing the truth. Of course, there were instances of these ideological affirmations in our discussions too, because we were not sufficiently able to hear each other's stories, if you will. Slide 9. Cone continues, when people can no longer listen to other people's stories, they become enclosed within their own social context, treating the distorted visions of reality as the whole truth. One sense, denominationalism, stark and bounded, is a closed story, not a whole truth. And then it says, and then they feel that they must destroy other stories, which bear witness that life can be lived in another way. Just two very quick comments. You see, in both synods, and as I said earlier, there's an unwritten expression, we are a small church. There is danger in future of something. So my sense is, if we become stronger, if we have a larger institution, a more investment and so on, things may be better. But in the biblical narratives, nor in the history of the church for 2,000 years, I can give you story after story from different parts of the history of the church, this has not been the case. When people are able to rejoice in the midst of their minority status, in the midst of their weakness, God has turned the life around for the life of the world. Of course, for me, the most favorite story comes from book of Zechariah. Book of Zechariah, chapter 2. May I have the slide? Slide 10, isn't it? No, maybe not. If you go back, you read it. We don't have the time to read it. There's a young man who wants to have his church very nicely measured and so on. He goes to measure the ramparts and towers. And when he goes there, and an older angel comes, stop there, young man. And he says, you no longer can measure Jerusalem because there is no rampart, no walls. Jerusalem is occupied like villages without walls. In their vulnerability, in the midst of their vulnerability, they are able to commune with one another. So the Jerusalem becomes a plural term. ACC, ELCA, two wall-less communities in conversation with each other. I'm almost done. Thank you. 5 minutes. Thank you for graciously. That's very good. We'll go to slide 10. Yeah. You see, with the confidence in the promise of God, with the powerful faith in the ultimate raw sovereignty of God, and in the power of the Spirit, we can be propelled to be vulnerable. Even when bullies all around were threatening, Jerusalem occupied like villages, sharing with each other in their strength. Right. Sisters and brothers, I think I probably will close with these words. It is a difficult task, frightening at times. We expressed it, many of you expressed it from the floor. And yet, the Spirit will journey with you. The slide before that, please. The one before. The previous slide. Right. Now, I'm going to ask you, I'll close with you. I'm going to ask you to read this particular sentence with me. It was from the Faith and Order Commission gathering in 1994. And this probably is a close fitting comment for what I wish for this church and what I pray for this church and the essence of what I wanted to say in these two sessions. May we read together. As we strip ourselves of false securities, finding in God our true and only identity, daring to be open and vulnerable to each other, we'll begin to live as pilgrims on a journey, discovering the God of surprises, who leads us into roads which we have not traveled, and we will find each other's true companions on the way. And I would like to add the next. May the God of surprises lead these two churches, its leaders, and all of you in the journey you have undertaken together for the love of the world. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again.
Well, Christopher, you've done it again. Another pacemaker jolt to the heart. You've helped us look in a mirror and see what has been transpiring over the last few days. And you've been kind enough to point out some of the strengths and the signs of the way we've been able to move forward with our third eye. But you have been a rocket booster. And in a gentle, inspiring, but no-nonsense way, you have encouraged us to get on with it and to get into the orbit of God's missional trajectory, and for those words of challenge, and for that vision of the way that we can still become more and more churches in love together for the love of the world. We give you thanks.
Thank you.
And we would like to give you a gift as a sign and token of how much we've appreciated your presence with us.
Thank you again. Such a great honor and joy to be with you.